Hello, thank you for watching my video, and don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and also leave a comment below. I am not going to focus too much on the military exploits of Alfred the Great. Like I done with my video on Edward I, I am going to focus on the character of possibly the most important king in English history. And also, I've already done a lengthy series on Anglo-Saxon history in which I covered the events of Alfred's reign. There is some doubt over when Alfred was born. Dates ranging from 843 to 849 have been given. He was born in Wantage in Berkshire, the son of King Athelwulf of Wessex and his first wife Osburh. Alfred's father was an extremely capable king, and his mother is also praised for her religious devotion. In both his parents, Alfred had a good example to follow. One of the most important early experiences of Alfred's life was when he travelled to Rome when he met the Pope, Leo IV, who supposedly anointed Alfred as his father's successor. This doesn't seem to make much sense though, as Alfred had older brothers. Whatever the circumstances were around Alfred's encounter with the Pope, the whole journey would have left an indelible mark on the young boy. That wasn't Alfred's only trip to Rome. A couple of years later, he went there again, this time accompanied by his father, Athelwulf. The first time Alfred had travelled to Rome, he had been escorted by a retinue of nobility and also some common men. On the return journey home, Alfred's father made a marriage with Judith, daughter of Charles the Bald, the future Holy Roman Emperor. Alfred's mother's death is not completely clear, but it surely must have been between 850 and 854 when Osburh passed away. It's hard to say how this would have impacted Alfred. His father, Athelwulf, died in 858, and he was succeeded by Alfred's brother, Athelbald. Rather scandalously, he married Judith, his own stepmother. Athelbald didn't last long, and his reign is accused of lawlessness. His and Alfred's brother, Athelbert, was the next to become king, and he appears to have done a better job. Athelbert fought the Viking invaders bravely and extended his kingdom, capturing places like Kent, Surrey, and Sussex. By this point, Alfred would have been approaching his teens, or perhaps even slightly older, and whilst the Viking attacks meant that the Saxon kingdoms were hard-pressed, Alfred could at least see that their kings, including his own father and brother, were not shying away from the problem and meeting them head-on. Athelred I, Alfred's one remaining brother, succeeded as king in 865. Having been so far off from the crown, Alfred was now potentially heir to the throne. Athelred did have two young sons, but when he died in 871, Alfred would have been in his early to mid-20s and far more ready to deal with the challenges that the 9th century brought to a kingdom. In times of Viking raids, having a young boy as king simply wouldn't do, and so Alfred was crowned King of Wessex in 871. Alfred's childhood seems to have been relatively happy. As I mentioned, he was loved by both his parents, but childhood in the 9th century was not easy, and by the age of around 10, he had lost both his mum and his dad. And although he had a strong love of learning, it wasn't until later in his childhood when he became fully literate. He also had an excellent memory, reciting poetry that he loved to listen to, and learned them word by word. And more practically, he was excellent in the hunt. Alfred seems to have not always enjoyed the best health. As he aged, Asa states that Alfred complained of innumerable ailments of which his doctors could do little about. Much to his frustration, this, coupled with the pressures of kingship, interrupted Alfred's love of learning. This led to him lamenting the lack of teachers Alfred had growing up, which explains his lack of literacy in early childhood. The fate of royal children through the Middle Ages was varied, and it was no different for Alfred's own children. A number of his children died young, and Alfred's successor, Edward, would not share his father's love of learning. Edward, though, would still go on to become a great king. Edward's sister, Ethelfled, would go on to become one of the most important women in medieval history, and without her, the successes of the reigns of Edward the Elder and Athelstan may not have been possible. Another of Alfred's daughters became a nun. But through his youngest son, Ethelweard, Alfred emphasized the importance of education. His youngest son was not only taught alongside other children from the nobility, but also children from more humble backgrounds. Alfred was spreading education not just for the rich, but also for the poor. Alfred was religiously devout, taking daily masses. No doubt his faith would have been tested by the Viking wars, but his early experiences in Rome must have strengthened his resolve. Alfred was the ideal of medieval kingship. His repression of the Viking attacks is just a part of his legacy. As a man, he was humble, pious, generous, and hospitable. His biographer, Asa, met him in person and tells how Alfred would sit and listen to men, Asa included, reading books aloud. He rewarded Asa with the possession of 2 monasteries, after Asa had somewhat obnoxiously demanded that he be allowed to return to visit the royal court again. On his arrival the first time, Asa had been greeted warmly, though why he thought a king as busy as Alfred undoubtedly was could guarantee that Asa would be allowed an opportunity to come back is only known to Asa himself. His obnoxious behaviour is rather funny, in my opinion. As king, Alfred had to be shrewd, and so he also had to be generous with money and distribution of power. By doing this, he knew that he could keep people on side. What Alfred, his kingdom, and the other Saxon kingdoms needed was unity rather than rebellion and uprisings. So if he had to bribe people, Alfred would do such a thing. In 886, Alfred had to rebuild London after it had sustained terrible damage from Danish attacks. He was a king, capable of leading his men both on land and on sea. You'll be hard-pressed to find a ruler more proactive than Alfred the Great. And by the time of his death in 899, he had begun the process of the unification of the Saxon kingdoms into what would become known as England. However, that job would have to be completed by his successors. His military exploits aside for a moment, the most enduring part of his legacy and the most revealing about the man that he was is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It was at his instigation that the Chronicle was compiled. Without it, the feats of Alfred the Great and his successors, and also predecessors, would be even more distant, perhaps even lost. For that, we have to be grateful to Alfred and his desire for people to continue to share in his love of learning.